Hi guys, Samantha from Jessama Tutorials here, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make these beads. So I've got quite a few requests to make these beads after I posted my translucent silver leaf Mokume Gane video, and so I decided that I'd show you how to make it. Now I've already done tutorials on how to make the watercolor technique, and I've also done a tutorial on how to make the translucent silver leaf part. So if you want to go and have a look at that and you want to see how to make those techniques, I will include those tutorials in the links below, so be sure to check that out. But basically you're going to need a sheet like this, which is the watercolor technique, and you're going to need some of these, which is from the translucent silver leaf tutorial. So I'll just bring some of those over, and this is what we're going to be using. So I'll first do the translucent silver leaf to form a sheet that we can cut our piece out of. So I'll just layer that on, and then I'm just going to move this out the way quickly. Bring this over, and we'll just roll it flat with our roller, because we want this to be nice and even. And then I'll bring this over to my pasta machine and roll it through on my thickest setting, which is a number 7. Okay, and so I've got a bit of a dip here, so I'm going to bring over another piece, my sheet, and I'm going to roll it through a pasta machine again on the thickest setting to try and get rid of that dip. Then I'm going to take it down to my number 5 setting, so that now we've got a fairly even surface over here. I'll just roll over it again. Then I'll bring over the cutter that I'm going to be using, and I got these off of eBay. I'll just bring it over. This is the cutter that I'm going to be using, and it comes in a set like this. I've got a few more, but they're a little too big for me to use as beads, so I haven't got them in the drawer at the moment. But they come in a set, and if you want to know where to buy them, I'll include a link for you if you want, and I'll include that in the links below. But basically you just want to cut out a bead like that. Then I'll bring over my watercolor, and now this is a little bit thinner than this one, but we want them to be of equal size. So I'm going to bring over some Prima Black, and I'm just going to make a sheet quickly. We don't need a very big sheet, just need it big enough for us to cut a piece of a bead out of it. Now that was on my 5th setting. Now I'm going to take it down to my number 3. Okay. Then I'm going to bring over my sheet, and I'm just going to move this out of the way actually, because I'm worried I'm going to accidentally get it. So just move that there, and I'll pop this over the top and smooth it down like so. Then I'll bring over my blade and pick it up, and then I go over to my pasta machine and put this through on the 5th setting. Just like that. Okay. So this is the part that we're going to use. So I'm going to choose an area that I like there. Cut out a bead and put this aside for another time. And I'll pick that up off of the tile, and I'll bring over our other piece, and so now these are of equal size. Then I'm going to bring over my flexible tissue blade. What I'm going to do is I'm going to very gently lay these on top of each other. Now, if your clay is very sticky, don't do this, but it's the best way to make sure that I get the right and equal cut out of each of them. I'm just laying them on top of each other very gently. I'm not pressing at all. Then you want to cut it off quickly and then quickly lift it off again, because you don't want the raw clay bonding to the raw clay. Get a little bit of sticks. It's stuck a little bit there, not too much. Just work that off. And that makes sure that I've got the same size cut for each one. Then I'll take the piece of one and wrap it around the other, just like that, and I'll do the same for this one so that I get 2 beads. Okay, and I sometimes need to just press it into place. Okay, and just make sure, don't worry about warping it too much. You don't want to warp it too much, but just make sure that these two are pressed together nicely and you get rid of that seam as best you can, just like that. Then you'll bring over your cutter again, and excuse me if my head gets in the shot, and you'll cut it into shape again, just like that. And you'll do the exact same for the other. Hold on. Okay, just like that, and it just trims it up and makes sure that it's nice and symmetrical. Then I'll just pick it up again and get rid of any pieces that are stuck to it. And when you're doing this, you want to work with a very light touch. You don't want to have heavy, clumpy fingers that are squishing things. You want to be working very lightly. Because at this point, when the clay is really raw, really soft and raw, you can end up distorting it. But basically, that's what we've got at the moment. And this is going to be the top side of our beads, like that. And now we've got a slightly different colorway, as you can see. So it's not going to look the exact same, but this is basically how I put the two together. Now I'm going to go and I'm going to get a black sheet, and we're going to put some bales on. Okay, and here's the sheet of black that we're going to be using. And here are the 2 bales that I've got. So, just going to move that over a second. I'm going to cut it out the shape I want, and I'm going to place the bale where I want it on the bead, just like that, and then I'm going to press it in gently. Then I'm going to take the other half of the bead and lay it carefully over the top and gently pat it down, just like that. And I'm going to pick it up and then just check the seam over here. And don't worry, we're going to fill in that gap once this is baked, because we don't want to mess with it too much, but we do want to go around and make sure that we've squished it down enough. Now I'm not pressing very hard while I'm doing this, I'm just gently going around and tapping. Then I'm going to go smooth it, just to make sure that I've avoided as much distortion as possible. Then I'm going to bring over my blade, and I'm going to be, this is the sharp side and this is the blunt side. I'm going to take the blunt side and I'm going to smooth it around the edge of the bead to push in any distorted edges. Just like that. Okay, so that's the one. and we're going to go and bake that. And now I'll just show you the other one as well. Bring over the piece again. Oops. And we'll cut out our bead. Well, we'll cut out our shape. And then this time, just got to make sure that you don't get any distortion. This time it's going to go on top like this. And I'm just going to press it in, and then I'll bring over the other part of the bead and lay that over the top and gently pat it down. Then I'll pick it up, and like with the other one, I'll just go around and pinch the edges very, very lightly. Not enough to distort it, just enough to make sure that the edges stick together. Okay. Then again, I'll bring over my blade, and with the blunt edge, go around and push in any distorted areas. Because this is best gotten rid of before you bake your piece. And because we've got a bail over there, we can't use a cutter to make sure that the shape's right. We have to do that by hand. It can be a little bit of a pain, but it just takes a little bit of practice. So I'm just making sure that it's nice and even, because this saves me a lot of sanding later on. Okay, there we are. Pick that up. Just remove that stuff out of the way. And that's what it looks like. So we're going to go back and fix up these edges a little bit, but these are the two that we've got so far. So I'll just shift them around so you can see. And we're going to go and bake these. Now, because I'm working with Polymer, I'm going to do it at Polymer's recommended temperature, which is 275 Fahrenheit or 130 Celsius for half an hour. And we're going to bake this a second time. I always like to bake my beads for about at least an hour. So if you're only going to do one bake and not do the edges or anything else to it, make sure that you bake for an hour instead of half an hour. And when you bake it, just make sure that you have a ceramic tile in your oven. This prevents spiking in the temperature. And also make sure that you have a piece of paper over the tops of your beads. And this will prevent scorching, because we're working with translucent clay in both of these techniques. And translucent clay is very prone to scorching. And so I always like to put a plain piece of printing paper over the top to prevent scorching. So I'll bake for half an hour, and then we can come back and do the edges. Okay, so these are finished baking, and now we are ready to clean up these sides. So the way you would do that is you would take a little bit of black. I'm using Polymer today because the bead is made of Polymer, but you can use any brand. So if you're working with Kato, you'd use Kato. If you're working with Polymer, you'd use Polymer, and so on. You just warm it up in your hands and form it into a little snake like that. Press it against your bead, and then using quite a bit of tension, smear it along the side of your bead, and this will give you a neater edge. So that edge versus that edge. Then you'll go back, roll it back into a ball, and then into a snake or a log. Press it against your bead, and using quite a bit of pressure, run it down the other side. Just like that. And it leaves a really, really, really nice finish on the side of the bead, and it's pretty easy to do. You'll just round off the corner And just make sure that it's to your satisfaction. Okay, and then once you've done that, you want to just take a bit of time to smear the clay all over the edges of your bead, and then smooth it off using the edge of your finger or your palm. Okay, and if you have any, just smooth around the edges over here, because sometimes you can have over lips where it's come over the edge of your bead. Just make sure to smear that off. Okay, and then because we have a bail over here, we're going to need to take a little bit of time to squish it into place around the bail. So I like to use the end of my blade. You can use any tool for this really, just to work off the excess clay and to fit it around so that it looks nice and neat. And I like to take a little snake, put it around the front over there, and then smooth that on as well. This takes a little bit of time, but it's well worth it because it will give you a nice finish. Just trying to make sure you can see exactly what I'm doing. So you can see that I'm smoothing it off with my blade on both sides. Then I like to scrape around the edges with the edge of my blade to make sure that I clean off any excess. Just like that. And that's basically what you have. And just make sure that you go around with your finger and smooth out any fingerprints, because you can't really sand this very much because you'll sand it right off of the bead after it's baked. So just make sure that you smooth out all your fingerprints, and that's what you should have. So I'll put that as to the side, and then I'll do this one, and then we can come back and resin them. Wait, no, actually, can't resin them yet, got to sand them, then resin them. Okay, so these are finished baking now, and we can start sanding them. So I use sanding papers, and I get these off of Fine Arts and Gems, and they start from a 400 grit to a 8000 grit, and these are what I'm going to be using today. You can use wet dry sandpaper as well, they work pretty well, but I really like the sanding paper, well, the sanding cloths, because, well, they're really flexible and they tend not to sand off the edges of your fingers so easily as the wet dry sandpaper. So you'll just start from your lowest grit and just start sanding. Now I recommend starting from 400 and going up as high as you can. I don't generally like to go lower than 400 because I find it can scratch the bead and then it causes problems. So I always start at 400 and then go up. So if I was to use wet dry sandpaper, I start 400, then go up to 600, then 1200, then 2000. And if I could get a higher grit, I would go higher. But I'd never go lower than 400 because I've just had bad experiences with it. So you'd start on your lowest grit and sand the front of your bead. You'd also sand the edges, and you'd also sand the back. And you'd continue to do this all through the grits until you've finished all through the grits, and then we could stop, and then we can come back and proceed to resin these. So I'll continue sanding these two beads, and then we can come back and varnish them. Okay, so now that we're finished with the beads, we can proceed with the resin. Now I'm using ice resin today, and this is what it looks like. Comes in 2 bottles, and this is the resin and this is the hardener. And you want to mix equal parts of each of these into a mixing cup like this one, and then very slowly stir it together. Now Ice resin can be very fiddly in the beginning, as it's not what you would call a very forgiving resin. If you get the measurements slightly wrong, you have to be meticulously accurate with your measurements, because if you get it slightly off, it won't cure. Now, if you're afraid to use this sort of two-part resins, Lisa Pavelka's Magic Gloss will work very well for this sort of thing, and that's a one-part resin. But I like using ice resin as it's cheaper and I've gotten used to how it works. The key to it basically is to just make sure that you measure it correctly. And then another thing that you always have to remember is that you need to mix it thoroughly. Now, you don't want to scramble it like an egg. You want to slowly fold it in like you would cake batter. You want to avoid air bubbles at all costs. But you want to spend at least 5 minutes mixing it. You want to scrape off your stirring stick. You want to make sure that you scrape around the edges and the bottom of your mixing cup, and just make sure that it's thoroughly mixed, because that's another large reason for your resin not curing. So just make sure that you measure it correctly and that you mix it thoroughly, and then your chances of not having cured resin will drop drastically. So just make sure you do that, and I'll come back when I've got this poured out and I'll show you how to mix it. Okay, so I've mixed up about 10 mils of resin, and this is because I've got 2 projects I'm going to be doing today, and so I need a bit more resin. Now, I'm going to be using a skewer to mix, as I find that it introduces less air bubbles than things like popsicle sticks. And all you want to do is you just want to slowly and deliberately mix in the resin. And in the beginning it will be very cloudy and it will have almost a pearlescent quality to it. And this is pretty normal. This is the 2 parts swirling together. And you'll know that you've mixed it correctly when this clears up to a crystal clear water-like consistency. So you want to mix until you've got rid of every single one of these striations. Not one can be left, otherwise your resin has the risk of not curing. So just take your time, scrape the edges of the cup, sometimes scrape the edges, scrape off your mixing tool and continue mixing. And don't scramble it, you just want to slowly stir and try to avoid air bubbles. You are going to get air bubbles, this is inevitable, I have found. It doesn't matter how slowly you mixed and how careful you are, you're going to end up with some air bubbles. But the goal is to avoid as many as physically possible. So I can take up to 5 minutes doing this. Now in the meantime, while we're waiting for this to clear up, I just want to mention that temperature has a big impact on resin in general. So I'm in midwinter at the moment, and so this resin's quite cold, which means that the curing process will take longer. It takes about 12 to 24 hours to cure, and in summer it can take maybe even 9 hours if it's really hot. And if you put it in direct sunlight, it can take less than 3 hours to cure. So the hotter your environment, the shorter your working time is going to be. But it also means that in a colder environment, you're going to have to wait for it to cure for a lot longer. So if you're living in a cold environment and you come back to your beads and they haven't cured within 12 hours, don't worry, it might be just that you're in a cold environment and it just hasn't fully cured. Leave it 24 hours, check again. If it's gloopy, then it's not going to cure, but if it's slightly sticky to the touch, leave it another 24 hours, and if it's still sticky and hasn't cured, then you haven't mixed it properly and you're going to have to start again. But it can take up to 32 hours to cure if your house or working area is very cold. So if you want to cure it faster, popping it in the sunlight will help, but in winter you've got to be prepared to wait at least 12 hours. In summer, however, if you put it in the midday sun, make sure that you're watching it the entire time because it can burn. I've burnt my beads before, and it can cure within half an hour in the sun. So temperature is a very important factor when using resins like this. So we're about mixed. As you can see, I've got a few air bubbles, but they're quite big. So if we pop these on the beads and then left the beads for about 5 minutes, maybe even 1 minute, these will float to the surface and you can blow on your bead with a straw and they will pop. And I'll show you that when we're done. So just scrape off the mixing stick and I'll go over and get the beads. Okay, so here's the resin mat that I have, and excuse me for the terrible colour, but this is what I have, and it is silicone, which means that resin comes off very easily. And so generally when you're working with resin, you can accidentally have spills on the sides of your beads, and so you want to be prepared to have those spills. And I find that having a silicone mat where the spills can slide into is much better than just putting it on a paper surface or a tile, because your beads can stick. So we're going to be doing these beads, and I just want to bring over another two, which I did in the meantime while I was waiting for these to bake. And here they are. They're a red version. And well, it was basically the exact same as these ones, just using different colours. Okay, so I'll bring over the resin, and I'm just going to use my stir stick to slowly pour the resin onto the beads. And now, when you're using resin, always use less than you need at first, and just spread that over the bead, and you can always add more. But once you've broken the, it's like water, where you have a certain amount of surface tension, but once you've broken that, it will just pour over the side. So you want to be very careful how much you put on, because you can get a dome, but if you break that domed surface and give it somewhere to go, the resin will pour over the sides of your bead and you'll end up with a mess. So you want to be very careful how much resin you put on. It's better to do 2 coats than to put too much on the first coat and then have to start all over again. Also, make sure that you cover all of your edges, because resin does tend to pull away from the edges of the beads, especially with magic gloss. Magic gloss, you're almost always going to have to do a second coat, sometimes even 3, and that is to be expected. But just make sure that you cover the edges of your bead. And so you can see here that the resin really brings out the colors and just makes everything look richer and more splendid than if you hadn't put the resin on. So I highly encourage using resin, as it just takes your bead to the next level. It can be a little difficult in the beginning, but it's well worth it. It makes it look wonderful. And it's not that difficult once you get used to it, just takes a bit of practice. So I'll continue resining the rest of these beads, and I'll come back to show you what they look like and how to pop the bubbles. Okay, so I've resined these beads, and now we're ready to blow away these bubbles. I've let them rest for about a minute or so the bubbles should have risen to the surface. Now I'm going to be using a straw. You can use any straw. And excuse me if my head gets in the shot while I do this, but you just want to blow the straw. Over the tops of your beads. And now I hope that you can see it when these beads pop, so just watch this bead closely. And that's basically how I like to get rid of my bubbles. So I usually am working in the area where my stuff is curing. So every 3 minutes or so I'd go back over to it and blow away these bubbles, and I'd continue doing that basically until it starts to cure, and that gets rid of any bubbles that accidentally got into the resin. And that's basically how I get rid of my bubbles. So we'll come back when these are cured in about 24 hours time. Okay, so our beads have finished drying, and well, when it was wet, I fixed up some of the spills and wiped the sides, but you can see over here that we have a spill over there, but for the most part there weren't any spills. So I'll just move these aside for the moment and just show you why I like using a silicone mat. So there's a good spill there and there's a spill there as well. Just flex the mat and it pulls out just like that. There's no problems, no hassle, just pop it out, and that means that your mat stays clean with very little hassle. So I'll just bring these over here and you can see them now that they're not on that horrible red background. And there we are. So that's what they look like. So now that you've got the bails in them and all sorts of things, you can go and string them on cord, ribbon, leather, whatever you want to string them on. I'm not exactly sure I'm going to use these for yet, but basically those are 4 pendants for you now to use whenever you want to. And so that's how I make these beads, and as you can see you can make them in different colorways if you want to, and that's basically how I make my pendants, some of them that is. And so I do hope that this video was helpful to you, and if it was, please do check out the links below. And if you are watching this on my website jessamatutorials.com, please do check below, as there'll be a form down there where you can send in pictures of what you've done using this tutorial, and I look forward to seeing what you've made. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please do check out the links below, as there'll be a link to my website jessamatutorials.com where you can send in pictures of what you've made, where you can find articles of information that I can't put into video format that I'm sure that you'll find helpful. So please do go check it out, as I'm sure you'll find it interesting and helpful. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video. Bye for now.